The wind in the Arizona territory didn't just blow, it howled. Tessa Hayes knew that sound well. It was the only music playing as she shoveled the red earth over a tiny pine box, her newborn son's final resting place. She was all alone. Her husband Mason Doyle was days away chasing golden whiskey, leaving her to face the harsh desert winter with nothing but sorrow. As the sun dipped below the canyon, a shadow stretched across the fresh grave. Tessa looked up, expecting a coyote or some drifter. Instead, she found herself staring into the war-painted face of an Apache warrior. He didn't hold a tomahawk, but a bundle. What he handed her wouldn't just save her sanity, it would unravel a conspiracy of blood-stolen land and a murder that the town of Redemption had tried to bury. November 1874. The Arizona Territory was a place where hope went to die, scorched by the sun and whipped by the wind. For Tessa Hayes, the world had shrunk to a patch of disturbed earth beneath a twisted mesquite tree. Her hands were raw, blistered from the spade's handle. She wasn't crying anymore. She had wept until her throat was dry and her eyes were swollen shut. Now there was only an empty silence. Her son, barely 3 days old, had succumbed to the fever that swept through the valley. They hadn't even named him. She had just called him Little Bird. Tessa stood up, wiping the dirt from her faded calico dress. She looked toward the horizon. The ranch house sat 100 yards away, dark and empty. Mason, her husband, had been gone for 2 weeks. He'd gone to Tucson for business, he claimed. Though Tessa knew his business usually meant poker tables and the company of women who smelled like cheap lavender water. She was 24, but the frontier had aged her. Her blonde hair was streaked with dust, her face thin. She felt a sudden sharp fear, not of death. She was close enough to death already, but of the solitude. Then the horses snorted in the corral. Tessa froze. She reached for the revolver she kept in her apron pocket, her fingers trembling. The sun was bleeding into the horizon, casting long purple shadows. From the twilight, a figure appeared. He didn't ride in. He seemed to materialize from the very earth. He stood tall, his broad chest bare despite the chill, marked with the pigments of his people. He wore buckskin leggings and moccasins that made no sound on the hard-packed earth. An Apache. Tessa's breath hitched. The tension in the territory was razor-thin. Raids had been frequent in the South, retaliation for the Army's encroachment. She thumbed back the hammer of her revolver. "Stay back," she croaked, her voice cracking from disuse. The warrior didn't flinch. He looked at the gun, then at the fresh grave at her feet, and finally into her eyes. His expression was unreadable, carved from granite. He was older, perhaps in his 40s, with a scar running through his left eyebrow. He took a step forward. "I said stay back." Tessa leveled the gun. Slowly, deliberately, the warrior raised his hands, but they weren't empty. In the crook of his left arm, wrapped in a rough wool trade blanket, was a bundle. He spoke then. His voice was deep, like stones grinding together. He broke the silence in English, heavily accented but clear. "Don't shoot, Mother." He pointed to the grave, then to the bundle in his arms. "The little one, she sleeps in the earth. You weep." Tessa lowered the gun an inch, confusion, battling with fear. "Who are you?" "Falcon," he said. It meant falcon in his tribe's dialect. He was Apache. He took another step forward, disregarding the weapon entirely. He knelt beside the grave, not in disrespect, but in strange homage. Then he stood and extended the bundle toward her. A sound came from the wool, a soft, gurgling coo. Tessa's heart stopped. She dropped the gun. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. "Take," Falcon said. "A life for a life, the spirit demands balance." Trembling, Tessa reached out. The warrior placed the bundle in her arms. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of wood smoke and sage. She pulled back the fold of the blanket. Staring back at her were 2 wide blue eyes. It was a baby boy, perhaps 6 months old. He was pale with tufts of reddish gold hair. He wasn't Apache. He was a white child. Where did you get him? Tessa Hayes gasped, clutching the child to her chest. The baby reached up, grabbing a lock of her hair. Falcon's face darkened. Found him in the burnt wagon south near the Black Canyon. He glanced toward the darkening south. His parents. Falcon turned his gaze toward the horizon. The spirits have them now. Only he remains. He needs milk. You have milk. It was true. Her body still ached with the need to nurse the child she had just buried. The physical emptiness inside her was only matched by the emotional void. Why bring him to me? Tessa whispered. You grieve, Falcon said simply. He lives. This is the way. Before Tessa could ask another question, who were the parents? Why would an Apache warrior save a white child instead of leaving him or trading him? Falcon whistled low. A paint horse trotted out from the mesquite brush. Falcon mounted in one smooth motion. Wait, Tessa called out. The baby, now settled in her arms, squirmed. Will you come back? Tessa asked. Falcon glanced at the horizon. The wolves are hunting the white woman. Watch the husband. He brings the storm. With that cryptic warning, Falcon turned his horse and vanished into the darkness. Tessa stood there, by her daughter's fresh grave, holding a stranger's son. For 3 days, Tessa stayed inside the ranch house, the shutters drawn tightly against the wind. The baby, whom she decided to name Luke IV, he was an unexpected messenger, was a voracious eater. Nursing him brought a strange, bittersweet relief. It eased the physical ache of her milk, and holding his warm, solid weight kept the ghosts at bay. She examined the blanket he came in. It was fine quality, woven with a distinct pattern of blue and yellow thread. Nothing like the rough wool of the local settlers. Pinned to the inside of the fabric was a small silver locket. Tessa pried it open with a fingernail. Inside was a tintype photograph of a woman, elegant and smiling, standing beside a man with a stern jawline and a handlebar mustache. They looked wealthy. Easterners perhaps moving west for land or mining. She hid the locket beneath the floorboards in the pantry. If Falcon had found the baby in a burnt wagon, it meant a raid. If the army found out she was harboring a survivor brought by an Apache, they would take the boy and likely question her until she broke. On the 4th evening, the dogs began to bark. Tessa looked out the window. A cloud of dust signaled the arrival of a buckboard wagon. It was Mason Doyle. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Mason was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a temper that flared like gunpowder. He had married Tessa for her father's dowry, and when the money ran dry, so did his affection. She placed Luke in the wicker cradle she had woven for her own daughter. She took a deep breath and stepped out onto the porch. Mason climbed down from the wagon, dusting off his heavy duster coat. He looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot from days of drinking. He didn't offer a hug or a kiss. "Where's the girl?" he asked, not looking at her busy unhitching the horses. "She died, Mason." Tessa said, her voice flat. 3 days ago." Mason paused. He spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Fever." "Yes." She nodded. He showed no more emotion than if she told him a calf had died. "Hard country. Weak things don't last." The cruelty of his words slapped her, but she didn't flinch. She was used to his hardness. "I buried her by the mesquite tree. I'll check the fence line tomorrow." He grunted, grabbed his saddlebags, and walked past her, smelling of stale whiskey and sweat. He entered the house. Tessa followed, her heart hammering in her chest. She watched as he threw his bags on the table and poured himself a glass of water. Then a sound came from the corner. A soft, distinctive coo. Mason froze. The glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing, as they landed on the cradle. "I thought you said she died." "I did," Tessa said quickly, stepping between him and the cradle. "Then what in the hell is that?" Mason pushed past her. He looked into the cradle. He stared at the blue-eyed boy, the reddish-gold hair. Mason Doyle's face turned pale, not with confusion, but with something else, recognition. He spun around, grabbing Tessa Hayes by the wrist. "Where did you get this brat?" "I found him." Tessa lied, her story stumbling out. "A wagon traveler's. They were sick, dying. They left him at the gate." "Liar!" Mason roared. He shook her. "There ain't been no wagons on the North Road for weeks. I rode that way." "He was abandoned, Mason," Tessa said. "What was I supposed to do? Leave him to the coyotes?" Mason looked back at the baby. His breathing was heavy, erratic. He looked terrified. "Red hair," he muttered to himself. "Blue eyes." He released Tessa, shoving her back against the wall. "Get rid of it." "What? You hear me, woman? Get rid of it. Ride him into town. Drop him at the orphanage in Prescott. I don't care, but he don't stay under my roof. He's a baby. I have milk, Mason. He needs me." "He ain't ours," Mason shouted. His hand drifted toward the knife at his belt, a nervous habit he had when he felt cornered. "You don't know who he belongs to. You don't know what kind of trouble comes with a stray. He's staying." Tessa said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "My daughter is dead. I am keeping this boy." Mason stared at her, his eyes cold and calculating. He seemed to weigh his options. Finally, he sneered. "Fine. You want to play mother, go ahead. But when the Reaper comes looking for that boy, don't expect me to stand in the way." He stormed into the bedroom and slammed the door. Tessa rushed to the cradle, scooping Luke up. She went to the window, looking out into the darkness. "Watch the husband," Falcon had said. "He brings the storm." Why had Mason looked so frightened? Why did the sight of a red-headed baby make a man who feared nothing but poverty shake in his boots? 2 weeks passed. The tension in the Doyle household was thick enough to choke on. Mason was rarely home. He spent his days riding the perimeter of their land, his nights meeting with men who rode in late. Rough men, gun hands like Cole Stroud, a notorious mercenary from Texas. Tessa kept her head down, caring for Luke. She noticed Mason watching the boy when he thought she wasn't looking. He watched him with a mixture of hatred and paranoia. One afternoon, while Mason was out with Cole, Tessa decided to clean Mason's study. It was a forbidden room, usually locked, but Mason had been careless in his haste to leave that morning. She entered the dusty room filled with maps and ledgers. She wasn't snooping for the sake of it. She was hunting for the truth. On his desk lay a map of the valley. Their ranch, the Broken M, was outlined in black ink, but the neighboring land, a massive fertile tract known as the Black Canyon Range, was circled in red. That land had been owned by the Sherman Black family, a wealthy Eastern family who had moved out west 6 months ago. Tessa's breath caught. Sherman Black, red hair. She rushed to the pantry and retrieved the silver locket she had hidden. She opened it. The man in the picture, the one with the handlebar mustache, had the same jawline as Luke. She went back to the study and began frantically searching the drawers. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of unpaid bills, she found a leather-bound ledger. It wasn't Mason's handwriting. It was elegant cursive script. October 14th, 1874. The survey is complete. The gold deposits in the lower creek are substantial. If we can get the irrigation rights, this land is worth millions. I fear the locals are hostile, particularly our neighbor, Mason Doyle. He has made threats regarding the water access. It was Sherman Black's diary. Tessa's hands shook as she flipped to the final entry dated 3 weeks ago. November 2nd. We are packing to leave for a week to file the claim in Tucson, taking the wife and the baby. We don't feel safe here anymore. I saw riders on the ridge today. I believe they are Mason's men. November 2nd. That was 2 days before Falcon brought Luke to her. The truth hit Tessa Hayes like a punch to the gut. Mason Doyle hadn't gone to Tucson for business. He had orchestrated a raid. He'd murdered the Sherman Black family to stop them from filing the gold claim. Made it look like an Apache attack and stole the land. But they had missed the baby. Or maybe the baby had been thrown from the wagon during the raid and found by Falcon. Looking for something darling, Tessa spun around. Mason was standing in the doorway. Cole Stroud was behind him, a toothpick rolling in his mouth and a Winchester rifle resting on his shoulder. Tessa's eyes fell to the ledger she was holding. A cruel, twisted grin spread across his face. "I told you," Mason said softly, stepping into the room. "Curiosity kills more than just cats in this country." "You killed them," Tessa whispered, clutching the ledger. "I did what I had to do to secure our future." Mason snarled, his mask of civility slipping. "That land has gold, Tessa. Enough gold to make us kings. But that Irishman wouldn't sell. He wanted a war. So you murdered his family?" "It was a business transaction," Cole chuckled from the doorway. "Though we did lose track of the little runt." "I assume that's the brat squalling in the other room," Mason said, pulling his Bowie knife from its sheath. The blade gleamed in the afternoon sun. "I knew that Apache had something to do with it." Mason spat. "I should have killed that savage years ago, and now my own wife turns against me." "Mason, please." Tessa backed up against the desk. "I won't tell anyone, just let us go." "Oh, you're going," Mason sneered, advancing. "You and that bastard child are going to take a little trip. A wagon accident, maybe. Tragic. Grieving mother driven mad drives off a cliff." "Grab her, Cole," Mason commanded. Cole moved forward, grabbing Tessa by the arm. She screamed, kicking out, but he was too strong. He dragged her toward the door. "Don't hurt the boy," she shrieked. "The boy dies first," Mason said, walking toward the cradle in the living room. Thwack! An arrow suddenly sprouted from the doorframe inches from Cole's face. The feathers were red and black. Cole froze, dropping Tessa. Through the open front door, a figure sat on horseback in the yard. Falcon. He had a bow drawn, the string pulled back to his ear. Behind him were 3 other Apache warriors painted for war. "I told you," Falcon's voice boomed, carrying over the wind. "The husband brings the storm. Today the storm breaks." The arrow in the doorframe vibrated with a low hum, a sound that seemed to freeze time in the Doyle ranch house. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Cole Stroud stared cross-eyed at the shaft of wood inches from his nose. His bravado vanished, replaced by the primal instinct of a hunted animal. "Apaches!" Cole roared, diving behind the heavy oak dining table just as a second arrow shattered the window glass, burying itself in the plaster where his head had been. Mason reacted with the desperation of a cornered rat. He didn't look at the attackers. He looked at Tessa. He lunged for her, his knife slashing through the air. "You brought them here, didn't you?" Tessa threw herself backward, crashing into the desk. The ledger, the damning evidence of Mason's murders, slid across the floor. Mason scrambled for it, but Tessa kicked out her boot, connecting with his jaw. He reeled back, spitting blood, his eyes wild with a mixture of greed and fury. "Cole, kill the Indians." "I'll handle the bitch," Mason screamed. Cole popped up with his Winchester, levering around into the chamber. Crack! The rifle shot thundered in the small room. Outside, Falcon's paint horse reared, but the warrior was already moving, sliding off the saddle and vanishing behind the water trough. Tessa saw her chance. While Mason was disoriented, she didn't run for the door. She ran for the cradle. The living room turned into a crossfire hurricane. Bullets chewed up the wood siding. Arrows hissed through the open door. She reached the cradle just as Luke let out a terrified wail. Tessa Hayes scooped him up, pressing his face into her shoulder to muffle his cries. "Going somewhere." Mason Doyle had recovered. He stood between her and the back door, the bloody knife in his hand. His face was a mask of pure malice. "Give me the boy, Tessa. I'll make it quick." "You're not a husband." Tessa spat, her fear hardening into cold rage. "You're a monster." I'm a survivor. Mason lunged. Crash! The front door flew off its hinges. It wasn't Falcon. It was one of the younger braves, a whirlwind of motion. He didn't carry a gun. He held a war club. He slammed into Cole Stroud, who was reloading. The two men crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and curses. Distracted, Mason turned his head for a second. Tessa didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the wood stove next to her. With every ounce of strength she had, fueled by the grief of her lost daughter and the need to protect this stolen son, she swung it. The iron connected with the side of Mason's head, a sickening crunch. Mason's eyes rolled back and he crumpled to the floor, unconscious, but still breathing. Tessa didn't wait to see if he would wake up. She grabbed the leather-bound ledger from the floor where it had fallen, shoved it into her apron, and sprinted out the back door into the twilight. The cool air hit her face. The yard was chaos, dust, and smoke. Falcon's voice was sharp and commanding. "Here, woman!" Falcon was circling the house on his horse. He extended a hand. Tessa shifted the baby to one arm and reached up. With surprising strength, Falcon hauled her up behind him. "Hold tight," he grunted. "My husband. He's inside." "He's alive," Tessa yelled over the gunfire. "He is of no matter now. The soldiers come soon. We must ride." Falcon kicked his horse into a gallop. As they crested the ridge, Tessa looked back. The broken M Ranch, the place where she had buried her child and lost her innocence, was shrinking in the distance. Smoke poured from the windows. She wasn't just leaving a house. She was leaving the white world. She was riding into the wilderness with a savage and a kidnapped baby, branded a traitor by her own people. But as she felt the steady beat of the horse's heart beneath her leg, Tessa realized she had never felt safer. The journey into the Superstition Mountains was a descent into a world that civilization hadn't yet touched. For 2 grueling days they rode through a landscape designed to break the human spirit. The terrain was jagged with red rocks, cactus spines, and vertical drops into bottomless shadows. Tessa held onto Falcon's waist, her body numb from the saddle, her arms aching from the weight of the baby. Luke had been quiet the first day, but by the second afternoon, his silence turned into a whimpering lethargy. His skin was hot to the touch, a dry, burning heat that terrified Tessa more than the bullets they had fled from. They were not alone. Falcon's small band of warriors, Talon Ridge and Buck, moved like wraiths around them. They rode without saddles, their ponies picking through the shale with impossible grace. They didn't speak. They communicated in hand signs and the mimicry of bird calls, a language born of the land itself. By the time the sun began to bleed into the western horizon on the 3rd day, they reached the sanctuary. It was a box canyon known to the Apache as the Canyon of the Whispering Wind. The walls shot up 300 feet, sheer sandstone glowing ember red in the twilight. The entrance was narrow, a bottleneck that opened into a natural amphitheater, protected from the biting desert gales. "We stop," Falcon announced, sliding off his paint horse. His voice was rough, coated in dust. "The horses need water, the boy needs rest." Tessa slid down her legs, nearly giving way. She stumbled toward a small depression in the rock where a spring trickled from a crack, feeding a small pool bordered by hardy ferns. She sat heavily, unwrapping Luke from the dusty shawl. "He's burning up Falcon," Tessa whispered, dipping a rag into the cool water and dabbing the baby's forehead. "He needs medicine. He needs a roof." Falcon began to unsaddle his horse, his movements efficient and precise. "The roof does not make the fever break woman. The spirit fights the body. He is strong. He has the blood of the red beard." Tessa Hayes looked up, her eyes stinging with exhaustion. "You keep calling his father that. Redbeard. You talk as if you owed him something." Falcon paused. He walked over to the small fire Talon was building, a smokeless fire made of dry greasewood roots, hidden deep in a rock overhang. Falcon sat across from Tessa, the flickering light casting deep shadows across his scarred face. He pulled a strip of dried venison from his pouch and handed it to her. Eat. Then you will have milk. Tessa took the meat but didn't eat. Tell me if we're going to die out here. I want to know why an Apache warrior risked his life for a white baby and a settler's wife. Falcon stared into the fire. The wind whistled through the canyon crevices, creating the eerie, hushed voices that gave the place its name. 2 moons ago, Falcon began, his voice low and rhythmic. I was hunting near the Salt River. I was alone. I tracked a cougar. I didn't see the iron teeth beneath the leaves. A bear trap, Tessa guessed. A wolf trap, Falcon corrected. Put there by your people. The jaws snapped on my leg. Bone didn't break, but the iron bit deep. I could not open it. I was trapped for 2 days. The sun cooked my mind. The coyote circled, waiting for me to sleep. He gestured to the scar on his eyebrow. Then the man came, the one with the fire-red hair, Sherman Black. He found you. He found me. He had a rifle. He could have shot me. A dead Apache is worth $50 in Tucson. That's the bounty. Falcon's dark eyes bore into Tessa's. But he didn't shoot. He saw the trap. He put down his gun, used a heavy branch to pry the jaws open, gave me water from his canteen. He washed the wound with whiskey. Tessa felt a tear slide down her dusty cheek. She could picture it. Sherman Black, civilized and wealthy, showing mercy to a sworn enemy in the middle of nowhere. It was the exact opposite of Mason Doyle. He spoke words I did not know, Falcon continued. But I understood. He let me go. He turned his back to me and walked away. He gave me my life. When I saw the smoke at his wagon, when I saw the bodies, I knew I could not pay the debt to him. So I pay it to the cub. Falcon looked at Luke, who was finally sleeping, his breathing shallow. And you? Falcon pointed a calloused finger at Tessa. You are not like the other white women. They scream. They faint. You dug the grave. You swung the iron skillet. You ride with the wind. I had no choice, Tessa said softly. There is always a choice, Falcon replied. To lay down and die or to stand and bleed. You chose to stand. That is why you are Nantan Lupon. What does it mean? Gray wolf mother. Tessa looked down at her hands stained with earth and dried blood. She didn't feel like a wolf. She felt like a ghost. Suddenly the silence of the canyon was shattered. It wasn't a gunshot. It was something far more subtle, the click of a horseshoe striking stone. Falcon was on his feet in a heartbeat. His relaxed posture vanished instantly. He was a statue of tension, his head cocked, listening to the echoes bouncing off the canyon walls. Talon and the other warriors were already moving, melting into the darkness at the canyon edges. Weapons drawn. What is it? Tessa whispered, clutching Luke to her chest. Metal shoes, Falcon hissed. Many horses. They move slow. They track. Is it the army? Falcon shook his head. Army rides heavy. They make noise with sabers and canteens. These men ride quiet. Hunters. Tessa Hayes' blood ran cold. Mason Doyle. And Cole Stroud. They've found the trail, Falcon said. He scanned the high rim of the canyon, his eyes narrowing. The wind carried our scent. We have to leave. Tessa stood up, panic rising in her chest. Falcon, she gasped. We have to ride out the back way. Falcon looked at the horses. They were standing with their heads low, their flanks heaving. They were exhausted. Then he turned his gaze to Luke, trembling in Tessa's arms. The horses are spent, Falcon said grimly. The pass ahead is steep rock. If we ride tonight, the horses will break a leg in the dark. If we run, the cold will kill the boy before the morning sun. So we just stay here and die. Tessa's voice cracked. No, Falcon turned to her, his face painted with a terrifying resolve. We do not run. We set the snare. The box canyon is a trapped gray wolf mother. But tonight we decide who is the hunter and who is the prey. He grabbed Tessa by the arm, guiding her away from the fire and toward the cliff wall. He pointed to a fissure in the rock face, a narrow climb that led to a small hidden cave about 30 feet up. Go, he commanded. Take the child. Climb high. Do not make a sound. Do not come out no matter what you hear, even if I fall. When Tessa hesitated, her eyes scanning the formidable climb. Falcon, there are too many of them. Falcon pulled a long knife from his belt, a heavy Bowie knife he had taken from a soldier years ago. He pressed the handle into Tessa's hand. The steel was cold and heavy. If the snake husband comes to the cave, Falcon said, his voice as hard as flint, you know what to do. I won't let him take the boy. Tessa nodded, her grip tightening on the knife's handle. Go. She scrambled up the scree, her boots slipping on the loose rock. She hauled herself up the narrow chimney, scraping her elbows raw, protecting Luke with her body. When she finally reached the small cave, she collapsed breathless. It was a shallow depression, hidden by dry brush. From her vantage point, she could see the entire canyon floor bathed in the silver light of the moon. She saw Falcon below, kicking dirt over the fire to extinguish it, plunging the canyon into shadow. She saw the warriors positioning themselves behind boulders and scrub oak blending so perfectly with the land that they seemed to vanish into thin air. Then the entrance of the canyon darkened. Silhouettes appeared, men on horseback, moving slowly, cautiously. Tessa counted them as they filed in. 10, 12, 14 men. The moonlight caught the glint of a silver star on a vest. A marshal, but riding next to him with a bandage wrapped around his head and a face twisted in hate was Mason Doyle. I smell smoke! Mason's voice drifted up, echoing ominously off the canyon walls. They're here, Marshal. I can feel it. The savage is here. And he's got my wife. Tessa pressed her hand over Luke's mouth as he stirred, tears silently streaming down her face. She gripped the knife Falcon had given her. The trap was set. The canyon held its breath, waiting for the first drop of blood to fall. The silence stretched tight like a bowstring. Below, the posse fanned out. Their horses were nervous. Hooves clattered on the loose stone. Tessa pressed herself into the dirt of the high cave, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Something ain't right, Mason, Tessa whispered. The voice drifted up Sheriff Holt. It's too quiet. Even the crickets have stopped. They're hiding in the rocks, Tessa rasped. Scared of the law, you there, Cole. Light a torch, Sheriff Holt ordered. Let's see what shadows are chasing. A match flared. As the flame touched a pitch-soaked brand, illuminating the canyon floor, in a sudden wash of orange light, the trap sprang. Thwip! A sound like a tearing sheet cut through the air. The man holding the torch gasped, stumbling backward, with an arrow sticking from his shoulder. He dropped the brand and the darkness rushed back in, more oppressive than ever. Ambush! Cole Stroud roared, diving behind a fallen slab of sandstone. Douse the lights. Get to cover. The canyon erupted. It wasn't a battle of lines and orders. It was chaos. Falcon and his 3 warriors were like shadows, shifting positions after every shot. A muzzle flash would bloom from the high rocks to the left, followed by the crack of a Winchester, sending the posse scrambling. Then an arrow would hiss from the right. The echoes amplified the sound, making 4 Apache warriors sound like 40. Tessa Hayes watched from above, terrified and mesmerized. The canyon floor was a strobe-lit nightmare of gunfire and shouting men. Hold your fire, damn it! You're shooting at shadows, Sheriff Holt bellowed, trying to maintain some semblance of order as his deputies fired wildly into the cliffs. Kill them all! Mason Doyle was screaming, crouching behind his horse, eyes scanning the darkness, not for targets but for his wife. The woman find the woman. The tide of battle began to shift not through skill, but through sheer brute force. Mason had come prepared for war. "Stroud!" Mason shouted. "Bring up the mule, set up the gun." Tessa peered over the ledge. 2 men were dragging a terrified mule forward. They unpacked a heavy canvas-covered contraption and stripped the cover, the moonlight glinting on brass barrels. A Gatling gun. It was an older model, clunky and heavy, likely surplus from the war. But in a confined box canyon, it was a weapon of mass destruction. "No," Tessa whispered. Cole Stroud cranked the handle. The mechanism clattered, then roared, rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat. The sound was deafening, a mechanical thunderstorm that drowned out everything else. A stream of lead chewed into the sandstone walls where Falcon had been firing. Rocks splintered and flew like shrapnel. The Apache warriors were instantly pinned, forced deep into the crevices of the canyon walls. "That's it," Mason laughed, his voice high-pitched with manic excitement. "Chew him up. Now flush them out. Burn the brush." "Mason, that ain't necessary," Sheriff Holt yelled over the gunfire. "It's my land, Sheriff," Mason sneered. "I'll burn it if I want to. Flush the rats." Under the cover of the Gatling gun's suppressive fire, 2 of Mason's hired hands ran forward with kerosene tins. They splashed the fuel onto the dry mesquite and tumbleweeds at the canyon's mouth, then threw a lit match. The effect was instantaneous. The dry wood, seasoned by years of drought, caught with a whoosh. A wall of fire roared to life, feeding on the oxygen in the narrow canyon. Up in the cave, the temperature spiked. Smoke, thick and oily, began to roll up the cliff face, drawn by the draft. Tessa coughed, clutching Luke. The baby began to wail, a thin, high cry that was lost in the roar of the fire. The smoke stung her eyes, filled her lungs. The heat was becoming unbearable. If she stayed, they would suffocate. If she climbed down, she would be shot. She looked at the knife in her hand. Then she looked at the ledger in her pocket, the heavy book that detailed every ounce of gold Mason had stolen and the murder he had planned. "I will not die in a hole," she rasped, her voice rough with smoke. Tessa stood up. She stepped out of the cave onto the narrow limestone ledge, fully visible against the backdrop of the smoke-filled moon. "Mason," she screamed. Her voice, shrill and desperate, cut through the mechanical rhythm of the Gatling gun. Down below, heads turned. The firing slowed. "Stop!" Sheriff Holt ordered, waving his hat. "See the fire, look up there." The Gatling gun spun to a halt. The silence that followed was filled only by the crackle of the flames eating the brush. Mason stepped out from behind his horse. He looked up, squinting through the haze. He saw her, a silhouette in a torn dress, holding a baby in one arm and a book in the other. "Tessa!" Mason called out, his voice dripping with sickly sweetness. "Come down, darling. It's over. You're safe now. The savages can't hurt you. The only savage here is you," Tessa yelled back. She held the ledger high. "I know what you did, Mason. I have the book, Sherman Black's diary." A murmur rippled through the posse. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. "She's delirious," Mason Doyle shouted to the men, his face twisting in panic. "The heat's got to her. She's talking nonsense." Tessa Hayes screamed, addressing Sheriff Holt directly. October 14th, he surveyed the land. November 2nd, he ambushed the wagon. He killed the parents and tried to kill this boy. Sheriff Holt stepped toward Mason, his hand resting on his revolver. "Is that true, Doyle? You said it was an Apache raid." Mason's eyes darted between the sheriff and his wife. The walls were closing in. The charade was crumbling. His greed had built a house of cards, and Tessa was holding the match. "Cole Stroud!" Mason shrieked, pointing up at the ledge. "She's got a gun. Shoot her." "She's holding a book, Mason," Sheriff Holt shouted. "Do it, Stroud, or you don't get paid," Mason barked. Cole Stroud, cold and mercenary to the bone, didn't hesitate. He wasn't shooting to kill. He was shooting to end the standoff. He raised his Winchester and fired a single shot at the rock shelf supporting Tessa's weight. Crack! The shale, already weakened by the heat and the earlier Gatling fire, shattered. Tessa screamed as the ledge gave way beneath her. She fell 20 feet, tumbling down the steep scree slope. She hit the ground, hard, rolling instinctively to shield Luke. They slid through the dust and ash, coming to a stop near the edge of the inferno. The ledger flew from her hand. It skidded across the dirt and landed dangerously close to the flames. Mason was on her before she could even breathe. He kicked Tessa in the ribs, flipping her onto her back. She gasped, the wind knocked out of her, clutching the crying baby. "You stupid, stubborn witch!" Mason hissed. He snatched the ledger from the ground, looked at it for just a second, the evidence of his damnation, and then hurled it into the heart of the bonfire. "No!" Tessa shrieked, reaching out. "Gone!" Mason sneered, looming over her. The firelight made him look like a demon, his eyes wide and white. "And now you go too. A tragic accident." "Killed in the crossfire," Mason said, drawing his Colt revolver, aiming it at her chest. "Sheriff, help!" Tessa screamed, but Sheriff Holt was blocked by the fire and the confusion. Mason pulled back the hammer. "Goodbye, Tessa." Thud. A heavy, wet impact sounded like a butcher striking meat. Mason staggered forward, the shot going wide into the dirt. He looked down. The head of a tomahawk was buried in his right shoulder, severing the muscle. He screamed, dropping the gun. Through the smoke, a figure emerged. It was Falcon. He was bleeding from 3 separate bullet wounds, his chest heaving, his war paint smeared with blood and ash. He looked less like a man and more like the spirit of vengeance itself. He had thrown his last weapon. Now he had only his hands. "Shoot him!" Mason squealed, clutching his shoulder and backing away toward the fire. "Help me!" But the posse stood frozen. They had seen Mason burn the book. They had seen him aim at his wife. The spell of authority was broken. Falcon didn't run. He walked. He walked through the sparks and the heat, his eyes locked on Mason. Mason, panic-stricken, fumbled for the knife in his boot with his left hand. He lunged at the Apache, a desperate, clumsy strike. Falcon caught Mason's wrist. The warrior was weakened by blood loss, but his grip was iron. He twisted Mason's arm, forcing him around. They grappled at the edge of the inferno, the heat blistering their skin. "The debt is paid," Falcon growled in English, his voice a low rumble. He shoved Mason. Mason stumbled back at his heel, catching on a rock. He flailed his arms, windmilling, but there was nothing to grab. He fell backward, screaming directly into the roaring bonfire he had built to kill them. The flames swallowed him whole. His screams were terrible, piercing the night, thrashing in the heart of the blaze until the smoke choked him into silence. Tessa pulled herself up, clutching Luke. She watched the fire. Falcon stood by the edge of the flames for a moment, watching the storm consume the man who brought it. Then the great warrior's knees buckled. He collapsed into the dust. The blood from his wounds pooled dark against the red earth. "Falcon!" Tessa Hayes cried, scrambling toward him. Sheriff Holt and the deputies finally rushed forward, kicking sand onto the fire. Guns lowered. The battle was over. The only sound left was the crackle of the dying flames and the soft, terrified whimpers of the child who had survived it all. The dawn that followed the night of fire was gray and somber, smelling of wet ash and cooling iron. The box canyon, once a place of violent echoes, was now deathly silent. Sheriff Holt knelt beside Falcon. The Apache warrior was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. His chest was a map of violence. 3 bullet wounds, burned skin, and bruises that would have killed a lesser man hours ago. "He's done for Tessa," Sheriff Holt said, quietly, standing up and dusting off his knees. "Even if I wanted to help him, the town won't take kindly to a renegade in the doctor's office. Best to let him go here." Tessa, her face streaked with soot and tears, looked up from where she sat rocking Luke. The fear that had driven her for weeks was gone, replaced by a cold, unyielding steel. "No," she said. Sheriff Holt blinked. "Ma'am." Tessa stood up. She handed Luke to the youngest deputy, a boy who looked terrified to be holding a baby. She walked over to Falcon and tore the hem of her petticoat, pressing the fabric against his bleeding chest. "Put him in the wagon," Tessa ordered. "Now, Mrs. Doyle." Sheriff Holt started, his tone patronizing. "You've been through a hell of a shock, but this man is a wanted—" Tessa interrupted. Her voice cut through the canyon air like a whip. "Save the Sherman Black heir. He saved me, and he killed the murderer you failed to catch. You will put him in the wagon, Sheriff, and you will ride him to Doc Amos. If he dies because you dragged your feet, I'll tell every newspaper in the territory that the law stood by and let a hero bleed out." Sheriff Holt stared at her. He looked at the charred remains of Mason Doyle still smoking in the fire pit. He looked at the silent, respectful distance the other Apache warriors, Talon Ridge and Buck, were keeping on the ridge. "Load him up!" Sheriff Holt grunted to his men. The trial of Cole Stroud, 3 months later, was the event of the decade for the Arizona Territory. The courthouse in Prescott was packed to the rafters. Though the ledger, the damning diary of Patrick O'Malley, had been consumed by the fire, the testimony was irrefutable. Sheriff Holt took the stand and recounted the events in the canyon, the ambush, the Gatling gun, and Mason Doyle's attempt to murder his wife. But it was Tessa who silenced the room. Dressed in simple black, holding Luke on her lap, she told the story not as a victim, but as a witness. She spoke of the greed that had rotted her husband's soul. She spoke of the Sherman Black family, murdered for a vein of gold in the creek. When Cole Stroud was sentenced to hang, there were no cheers, only a heavy, somber acknowledgement that justice, though messy, had been served. Tessa returned to the Broken M Ranch, but she didn't stay in the house. She couldn't. The walls held too many memories of Mason Doyle's heavy footsteps. Instead, she moved into the Sherman Black homestead on the neighboring Black Canyon Range. She petitioned the courts for guardianship of Luke with no living relatives, found back east, and with the testimony of her bravery, the judge granted it. She wasn't just his guardian. She was his mother in every way that mattered. But there was one piece of business left: the gold. Surveyors came from Tucson, eager to reopen the claim Mason Doyle had killed for. They offered Tessa a fortune for the mining rights. She took them to the creek. She showed them the clear running water that fed the valley's cattle and the wild herds. "My husband died for this metal," Tessa told the lead surveyor. "He killed a family for it. This gold is cursed. There will be no mine here." "But Mrs. Doyle," the man protested, "you're sitting on millions." "I'm sitting on blood," she replied. "Pack your tools. We raise cattle here, nothing else." 6 months passed. The scars of the past began to fade, replaced by the calluses of hard work. Tessa ran the Black Canyon Ranch with a firmness that surprised the local hands. She paid fair wages. She didn't tolerate drunks, and she was known all over the county as the widow who walked through fire. It was a late afternoon in October when the dogs began to bark. Tessa Hayes was on the front porch churning butter, while Luke, now a sturdy toddler with a shock of red hair, wobbled around chasing a beetle. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the ridge. A single rider was silhouetted against the setting sun. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen him since the night in the canyon. Amos had patched him up, but Falcon had refused to stay in town a moment longer than necessary. He had vanished into the mountains before his stitches were even out. Tessa picked up Luke. "Look," she whispered. "Look who it is." She walked out to the fence line. The rider descended slowly. Falcon looked different. The war paint was gone. He wore a clean buckskin shirt and a necklace of turquoise. His limp was slight, barely noticeable. He stopped his horse 10 feet from the fence. He didn't dismount. The barrier between their worlds, settler and native, remained. But the hostility was gone. You live, Falcon said. It wasn't a question. We live. Tessa nodded, hoisting Luke up. Thanks to you. Falcon looked at the boy. Luke stared back with wide blue eyes, fearless. The cub grows, Falcon noted. He has the fire of the red beard, but the eyes of the mother wolf. He knows your name, Tessa said. I tell him stories about the falcon who brought him home. Falcon's stoic face cracked just a fraction into something resembling a smile. He reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a small object wrapped in leather. He tossed it gently. Tessa caught it with one hand. It was a carving, a small, intricate wolf made of ironwood, polished smooth. For the boy, Falcon said, to remember that he walks between worlds. Will you come in? Tessa asked, opening the gate. There's food. There's a place by the fire. Falcon looked at the open gate, then back at the mountains looming purple in the distance. The hawk does not nest in the barn, Nantan Lupon, he said softly. My war is done here, but the path goes on. He gathered his reins. The paint horse shifted, eager to run. Falcon, Tessa called out. He paused. Thank you. Falcon looked at her one last time. He raised his hand palm out, a gesture of peace and respect that bridged the chasm of history between their people. Watch the wind, Tessa, he said. With a kick of his heels, he turned the horse. He didn't look back. Tessa watched him ride. A solitary figure moving through the sagebrush, getting smaller and smaller, until he was just a shadow against the dying light. She looked down at the wooden wolf in her hand, then at the son she had chosen and who had been chosen for her. The wind blew across the vast Arizona territory. It rustled the dry grass and spun the windmill blades. It no longer sounded like a scream or a mournful cry. To Tessa Hayes, standing tall on her own land, it sounded like a song of freedom. Come on, Luke, she whispered, kissing the top of his head. Let's go home. And that, my friends, is the legend of Tessa Hayes and the Apache warrior falcon. A story of how a grieving mother found a new purpose and how the unlikeliest of allies brought down a tyrant. Justice in the Old West wasn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it was found at the end of a tomahawk and the courage of a woman who refused to break. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Do you think Tessa made the right choice keeping the gold in the ground? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring that bell. I've got another tale of betrayal and revenge from the 1880s coming up next week that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching and keep riding the trail. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visual scripts. As creative assistants, however, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.